A team of researchers points a laser scanner at a granite wall in Aswan, Egypt. Within minutes, the machine captures a three-dimensional map of every curve, every groove, every scoop mark carved into the stone thousands of years ago. Then, an AI model goes to work on that data, comparing thousands of measurements at once, looking for patterns no human eye could catch by walking through the quarry with a notebook. What comes back is not a wild theory, it's something more interesting. Real, measurable evidence that the old, simple explanation for how these marks were made might not be the whole story. This is the story of the Aswan quarries, the strange scoop marks that have puzzled archaeologists for over a century, and what happens when 3D scanning and AI-based analysis are finally pointed at one of the oldest unsolved puzzles in Egypt. Let's start with the place itself. Aswan sits on the banks of the Nile River in southern Egypt, hundreds of miles south of Cairo. For thousands of years, this region supplied granite for some of Egypt's most iconic structures. Temples, statues, obelisks, and parts of the pyramids all trace back to stone pulled from these quarries. Granite is not soft rock. It sits between 6 and 7 on the Mohs hardness scale, harder than most of the metal tools that were available in the ancient world. Cutting it, shaping it, and moving it would have been an enormous undertaking no matter how it was done, and that alone should earn ancient quarry workers more credit than they usually get. The most famous feature in the quarries is the unfinished obelisk. It's a massive single block of granite still attached to the bedrock, abandoned partway through construction after cracks appeared in the stone. Had it been completed, it would have weighed close to 1,000 tons, making it one of the largest single stone objects ever attempted by human hands in the ancient world. Around this obelisk are deep trenches, and the walls of those trenches are covered in the mysterious scoop marks that have drawn attention from researchers for generations. These scoops are roughly 6 to 8 inches wide and 2 to 4 inches deep. They curve in smooth, repeating arcs, layered close together in overlapping rows that create a rippled, almost wave-like texture across the stone. Touch them, and they feel smooth. Not jagged, not cracked, not fractured the way you'd expect from stone that was struck repeatedly with another rock. That smoothness is exactly what has kept this mystery alive for so long. For decades, the standard explanation was straightforward. Workers used handheld balls of dolerite, a stone that's harder than granite, to pound the surface again and again until material broke away. Over time, thousands of small impacts would carve out these curved depressions. It's a theory that makes sense on paper, and archaeologists have actually tested it in the field, not just argued about it in books. And that's where the story gets complicated. And when modern experiments recreate the dolerite pounding method, the results don't quite match what's carved into the walls at Aswan. Pounding tends to produce rough, irregular pits. Edges fracture unevenly. Depths vary from strike to strike, because no human arm swings with perfectly identical force every single time, especially not for hours on end, day after day. The marks at Aswan, by contrast, show remarkably little variation across large areas. The difference has been noted by researchers for decades, but without a reliable way to measure it precisely across an entire quarry wall, it remained more of an observation than a documented anomaly. People noticed it, mentioned it in passing, and moved on, because there wasn't a practical way to quantify just how consistent these marks really were. This is exactly where 3D scanning changes the picture. Over the past several years, teams working in Egypt have started using laser scanners and photogrammetry, a technique that stitches together thousands of overlapping photographs into a precise three-dimensional digital model, to document quarry sites in far greater detail than was ever possible with a camera and a measuring tape. Instead of relying purely on the human eye, researchers can now capture the exact geometry of every scoop mark across an entire trench wall. Every curve, every depth, every angle of entry, recorded down to fractions of a millimeter and stored digitally so it can be studied again and again without ever touching the original stone. Once you have that kind of data set, you can bring in AI-based pattern analysis. This isn't an AI system inventing facts out of nowhere or handing down a verdict from nothing. It's a tool built to process enormous data sets of measurements far faster and more consistently than a person manually comparing marks with a ruler and a notepad. When you feed thousands of scanned scoop marks into software designed for statistical pattern recognition, it can flag things like unexpected uniformity, repeating spacing intervals, or geometric consistency that would be extraordinarily difficult for a human researcher to spot just by walking through a quarry and eyeballing wall after wall. And that's exactly what has some researchers intrigued right now. Early digital surveys of sections of the Aswan trenches have found that many of the scoop marks are far more consistent in size and spacing than random hand tool percussion would typically produce. Not machine tolerance perfect, but consistent enough to raise real legitimate questions about exactly how much of this work was purely freehand pounding, and how much may have involved some kind of guided or templated technique that hasn't been fully identified yet. Perhaps a wooden or stone guide that steadied the swing, perhaps a technique passed down and refined across generations of specialized quarry workers, producing a level of muscle memory precision that modern one-off experiments haven't managed to replicate in a lab setting over a few weeks. It's worth being very clear about what this does and doesn't mean. It does not mean the marks were made by lasers, drills, or powered machinery. No trace of ancient electricity, no diamond-tipped industrial tooling, and no evidence of anything resembling modern cutting technology has ever been found in Egypt, and no credible 3D scan or AI analysis claims otherwise. What it does mean is that the old, simplified explanation, workers pounded randomly until stone broke away, might not capture the full picture. There may have been more method, more skill, and more consistency in ancient Egyptian stoneworking than that simplified explanation gives credit for. Now, let's talk about the deep test pits, because these are just as strange and just as poorly explained by the traditional story. Scattered around the quarries are narrow vertical shafts cut straight down into solid granite, some reaching 30 to 50 feet deep, while only being 3 to 4 feet wide. The traditional explanation is that these were exploratory pits, dug to check the quality of the stone below the surface before committing to a large extraction project. It's a reasonable idea on its face. Quarry workers everywhere, in every era of history, want to know if the stone they're about to invest months of labor into is solid or riddled with hidden cracks. But picture actually cutting one of these pits by hand, and the practical problems start piling up fast. Imagine being at the bottom of a shaft 40 feet down, only 3 feet wide. There's barely room to swing your arms, let alone a heavy stone hammer with any real force behind it. Dust would fill the air with nowhere to escape. Light would be minimal, meaning someone would need to constantly manage torches or oil lamps in a cramped, poorly ventilated space far below the surface. And every basket of broken stone chips would need to be hauled up and out, over and over, for the entire depth of the shaft. A slow and exhausting logistical chain on its own. Recent 3D mapping of a number of these pits has added another layer to the mystery. In several cases, the shafts don't cut in a perfectly straight vertical line. They curve slightly as they descend, following natural mineral veins or weaknesses inside the granite that aren't visible from the surface at all. That detail suggests the people cutting these shafts had some way of anticipating what was happening inside the rock, whether through generations of hard-earned practical experience reading subtle surface clues, or some method of testing that hasn't been identified in the archaeological record. Either way, it represents a level of practical geological awareness that doesn't get much attention in the standard, simplified story of ancient quarry work. There's also the matter of wall quality. In a hand-dug shaft, you generally expect the workmanship to get rougher the deeper it goes, because conditions get worse the further down you are. Less light, less air, more fatigue, more difficulty controlling your tools with precision. But scans of several Aswan test pits show wall quality that stays fairly consistent from top to bottom. That's a small, easy-to-miss detail, but it's exactly the kind of small detail that digital scanning is good at catching, and that easily slips past a quick visual inspection during a site visit. None of this proves some hidden advanced technology was in play, but it does mean the quick exploratory pit dug in an afternoon explanation doesn't fully capture what's actually preserved in the stone, and that gap is worth taking seriously rather than glossing over. Then there's the depression in the southern part of the quarry complex, an area long identified by archaeologists as an ancient harbor or loading zone, where finished stone blocks were supposedly moved toward the Nile for transport downriver. Some researchers who've studied the shape and volume of this depression using digital terrain models have proposed an alternative reading, that its dimensions look less like a harbor and more like the empty cavity left behind after an enormous single block of stone was cut and removed in one piece. If that interpretation holds up under further study, we're talking about a block that could have weighed several thousand tons, which would dwarf anything Egypt is confirmed to have successfully quarried and transported elsewhere. It's worth being honest here. This idea remains genuinely debated, not settled, and the harbor explanation is still the mainstream, more widely accepted view among Egyptologists. But it's a legitimately interesting open question, and it's exactly the kind of question that better 3D survey data, combined with careful geological modeling, may eventually help resolve one way or the other, rather than leaving it as a matter of guesswork based on the shape of a depression viewed from ground level. Now for one of the most debated pieces of evidence at the entire site, the red ochre paintings. In several spots throughout the Aswan quarries, there are simple reddish drawings on the granite surfaces, images of birds, boats, and geometric shapes, done in a style that closely resembles prehistoric rock art found elsewhere across the Sahara and along the wider Nile Valley. That artistic style is generally associated with a period thousands of years before the start of dynastic Egypt, long before the first pharaohs. Here's the detail that has sparked so much discussion among researchers. In at least a few documented locations, this paint appears to sit inside the grooves of the scoop marks, meaning the scoop had to be cut into the stone before the paint was applied on top of it. If that layering holds up under closer, more rigorous examination, it raises a genuinely fascinating timeline question because it would suggest that at least some of this stone-cutting work predates the paintings themselves, and by extension, may be considerably older than the dynastic period that most of the quarry's work is normally attributed to. It's important to stay careful and grounded here. Dating rock art precisely is genuinely difficult. Style alone isn't a perfect method for pinning down an exact age, and the paint-over-scoop relationship hasn't been confirmed consistently across the entire site, only in specific documented locations. Some archaeologists think these could be later additions layered onto older cut marks for symbolic or ritual reasons, not necessarily proof of some vastly older lost civilization. Others believe it deserves serious, dedicated dating work using modern chemical and stratigraphic methods, since this kind of layering, if verified more broadly across the site, would genuinely challenge the standard timeline in a meaningful way. Right now, it sits as an open, actively contested question rather than a settled fact, and any honest account of this site has to say that plainly rather than dressing it up as proof. So where does all of this actually leave us? We have scoop marks that are more geometrically consistent, once properly measured with 3D scanning, than basic dolerite pounding experiments have been able to reproduce under controlled conditions. We have deep test pits that show a level of planning, internal awareness, and structural stability that's hard to fully explain with a quick and rough digging process. We have a depression whose true shape might represent the largest single stone extraction ever attempted anywhere in the ancient world, or might simply be an old harbor, depending on which researcher you ask and which model of the site you trust. And we have prehistoric-style paintings that, in at least some documented places, appear to sit directly on top of cutting marks whose true age isn't fully settled. None of this is proof of ancient super technology hidden from history. It's not evidence of some mythical civilization armed with power tools centuries before their supposed invention. What it is a genuine ongoing scientific puzzle, one that's finally getting sharper now that researchers have the right tools to measure it properly for the first time. For over 100 years, people studied these marks mostly by eye, by hand, with rough field sketches and black and white photographs. Now, with high-resolution 3D scanning capturing every curve and every millimeter of depth across entire quarry walls, an AI-assisted analysis able to process that data at a scale no individual human researcher could manage in a lifetime. We're finally starting to see patterns that were always there, just too subtle and too spread out to notice without the right instruments. That's really the heart of this story. It's not that ancient Egyptians secretly had lasers or hidden machinery. It's that our tools for studying them have finally started to catch up to the actual complexity of what they built with their hands. The dolerite pounding explanation isn't necessarily wrong at its core, but it may well be incomplete. Maybe there were guiding techniques or specialized tools we haven't fully identified in the archaeological record. Maybe skilled hands, working generation after generation within a dedicated class of quarry specialists, developed a level of practiced precision that modern one-off experimental attempts simply haven't matched over a few weeks of trial and error. And maybe some marks really do belong to an earlier period than commonly assumed, in which case the paint layering evidence deserves a serious, rigorous, well-funded dating effort rather than being dismissed outright, or, on the other extreme, oversold as definitive proof of a lost civilization. What makes this genuinely exciting isn't some dramatic, sensational reveal or a shocking secret finally exposed after centuries of cover-up. It's that archaeology is entering a phase where digital tools let researchers ask sharper, better-informed questions of sites people thought they already understood completely. Every trench wall in Aswan can now, in principle, be turned into a precise digital twin, preserved forever, regardless of weathering or damage to the original stone. Every scoop mark can be measured, compared side by side, and cross-referenced against thousands of others in a matter of seconds, rather than years of manual fieldwork. Patterns that might have taken a researcher an entire career to notice by eye alone can now surface in a matter of days, simply because the data can finally be processed at scale. It's also worth stepping back and comparing Aswan to what we know from other ancient stoneworking traditions around the world, because that context matters. Cultures from the Andes to the Mediterranean to South Asia all developed remarkable methods for shaping extremely hard stone, using nothing but simple tools, patience, and generations of accumulated skill. In many of these cases, later experimental archaeology initially struggled to replicate the precision seen in the original work, only to eventually succeed once researchers better understood the specific techniques, sequencing, and tool combinations actually used. Aswan may well follow a similar arc. The current gap between experimental results and the real quarry marks doesn't necessarily point to something otherworldly. It may simply mean modern researchers haven't yet reconstructed the exact combination of techniques ancient workers relied on, whether that involves specific abrasive sands, particular sequences of pounding and grinding, or tool designs that haven't survived because they were made of wood or other perishable materials. And that raises an exciting possibility for the future of research at this site. As more of Aswan gets fully scanned in high resolution, and as AI-assisted comparison tools get better at cross-referencing quarry marks with known ancient and experimental cutting techniques from around the world, researchers may finally get closer to a real, well-supported answer. Not a sensational one designed to go viral, but a solid, evidence-based one about exactly how ancient workers achieved this level of precision using nothing but stone, copper, bronze, and an extraordinary amount of accumulated skill and patience passed down across generations of specialized labor. There are already ongoing survey projects working to digitize more of the quarry complex, section by section, building out a complete three-dimensional archive of the site that will let researchers study it collaboratively for decades to come without ever needing to touch the original granite. Combined with improvements in AI-driven measurement and comparison tools, this kind of long-term digital documentation is likely to be the thing that finally settles some of these open questions. Not through a single dramatic announcement, but through years of careful, incremental, well-documented work. Until then, the marks remain exactly what they've always been. Real, physical, measurable evidence carved into some of the hardest rock on the planet, waiting for the right combination of technology, patience, and rigorous science to finally explain them in full. The scoop marks are real, the test pits are real, the layered paintings are real. What's still uncertain is the complete explanation behind them, and that uncertainty is exactly what keeps researchers coming back to Aswan generation after generation, tool in hand, and now laser scanner and AI-assisted model in hand as well, trying to finish a conversation with these stones that began thousands of years ago and still isn't fully over.